It's just great to see you guys. This is what it's all about in the end, of coming together and encouraging each other and making sure we have enough to face another day with love and with kindness and with forgiveness and with patience toward other people so that we can become what we talked about last week, the sign of the kingdom of God becoming a reality in our midst. So let me use that as the transition into what we're doing together. For those who are visiting us, we are studying the book of Matthew together every Saturday morning at 11. Every Tuesday night at 6 p.m. in this place, we study the book of Genesis. We are finishing chapter 17, I think, there. Then in the newsletters every week, we're covering the book of James now. Saturday morning at 10, book of Daniel, and then Matthew for our 11 o'clock service. That's a lot of stuff. Whew. It's good. I love it. All in one breath? Well, not in one breath, I hope, or else I would die. But anyway. So you have Bibles underneath your seats if you didn't bring one. I'm using actually the same translation as the ones you'll find underneath your seats. Today we will begin chapter 5 of Matthew, and I am extremely excited, as you would know, because last week we covered something quite important. Probably one of the most important things for us as Christians to understand. That's what we talked about last week. If you were not here last week to hear us talking about the kingdom of heaven, what Jesus is all about, what His ministry is all about, what His preaching is all about, you can feel free to go on YouTube. All of our sermons, all of our messages are there for you to watch. You just go into, the World Wide Web, as it was called back in the day. Mary's already laughing at me here. And you just type in Advent Life Church and you can see everything we've talked about. But last week was crucial. If you get what happened last week, then we're good. You can never come back here, just go live life. No, I'm kidding. Come back to continue learning. But last week was crucial. Why? Because we noticed that the thing that consumed the preaching, the mind, the life of Jesus, the thing that made Jesus' death, resurrection, meaningful was the reality of the kingdom of heaven becoming a reality once again. And we saw that the kingdom is a past reality. It was something that was always there to begin with. It was lost with the Adam and Eve situation, and then nobody knows what's happening if God's reign will be a reality again. And then Jesus shows up and tells us that, yes, the kingdom was real in the past. That kingdom is coming in the future, concrete, real. But the craziness of the gospel is it happens now. You can have access to that kingdom now. You can embrace it. You can embrace the lordship of God in your life now and live as if that future reality is taking place right now. So why did Jesus heal? Because when He looked at the future, there's no sickness in that future kingdom, so He brought that into the present. Why did He teach about God's love? Because in that future kingdom, we will grow in knowledge of who God is, so He brought that into the present. Why did He feed the hungry, as we're trying to do together also as a church this following week? Because that future reality, He is bringing that into the present. So now as a community of believers, we are heirs, members of that kingdom. That was, that will be, but that is a reality today. So if you ask Paul what we do here together every week and how do we live life, we just follow Jesus into that kingdom living. Everything that will be true in God's future kingdom, we bring that into the present. We live lives of kindness and love and forgiveness because that's what the kingdom will look like in the future. Does that make sense? Yes or no? Isn't that beautiful? Yes or no? I love it. That's what it's all about. That's what Jesus came to do, to show us that the kingdom of heaven is here, is at hand. It's inside of us. It's outside of us, and we can be part of it today. So that was the review of last week. Is that good enough, Dave? I love it. It's perfect. I love it. Perfect. Perfect. I'll take perfect. So let's go with now Matthew chapter 5. We're going to read verse 1. You know how I go. And I bought a Bible that now is slippery. Look at that. I have to figure out something here. Let me see. Post-it notes. Let's see if this works. Didn't work, but we'll be okay. All right. Matthew chapter 5, verse 1 reads. Are you guys with me? Yes or no? Oh, now you are awake. Good. Sis, we good there in the back? Angela, can you hear me well? Rob, are you happy? So let's begin. Verse 1. Seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him, and what now will begin is what is known as the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' first message. Now, before we get into it, let's remind ourselves of Jesus becoming this embodied Israel movement that we've been seeing so far, right? First of all, Jesus has been through the water. Now he has been through the desert, as we have seen as well. Just like Israel in the past went through the waters, just like Israel went to the desert, and then came to a high mountain in the Old Testament known as what? Mount Sinai. Yeah. Just like that in the past, Jesus goes through the waters of baptism, goes into the desert to be tempted, so no wonder now he goes up a mountain to share now with his disciples, with the new Israel, what the law was all about in the first place. So are we seeing the movement? Yes or no? Good. So the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus now up on the mountain sharing insights as to what does the will of God look like? What does that kingdom mean? What does it mean? Who belongs to it? Who's part of that kingdom? He's saying the kingdom of heaven is here. What does that mean? Am I part of it? Is Dolores part of it? What does that kingdom look like? Those are the questions the Sermon on the Mount will answer. And by the end of it, we'll have a clear understanding that the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God, is not a kingdom of violence, is not a kingdom of killing, of chariots and horses, but it is a kingdom that has a whole different nature, Aina. Instead of strong and mighty soldiers, the kingdom of heaven has the poor in spirit, the meek, those who mourn, and those who are seeking for justice, who have a hunger for justice. It's just a beautiful thing. Now, before we get into the sermon, we need to see one more thing. Jesus will say a bunch of words beginning in chapter 5, 6, and then 7. What I want you to see with me is something that we normally don't do when we're speaking with the text as we are, following a sequence, but we're going to jump to the end of the text, the end of the sermon, which is in chapter 7. So let's flip a few pages, just so that you can see the reaction of the people after Jesus is done. This is in chapter 7, verse 28. So Jesus comes in as this new teacher, as this new rabbi. He goes up a mountain. Everybody is gathered. We already know from last week that he's already becoming very famous and multitudes are following him. We know that. So what is the reaction? After Jesus is done with this long, long speech, what is the reaction of the people? Are you guys ready to see it? Rarely do we have this sort of information in the Bible, so it's nice to see how they took it. Because it could be different from us these days hearing these words. We don't care. We'll go back to our day. But look at the reaction of the people after Jesus is done. 7:28. And when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were what? I have astonished. What do you have in your other Bible? Amazed. What else? Astonished and amazed. That's basically what we have. So the wording here is stronger than what we think. They literally fell off their chairs. Another modern way to talk about this is their minds were literally blown, exploded, right? Due to Jesus' teaching. Now here, obviously here we are sitting in the 21st century. There's heating, the seats are quite comfortable, and then we hear, blessed are the meek, and then we say, oh, that's cute, Jesus is like this new rabbi, and has like kind of a guru type, sharing wisdom, and we go back home to our modern lives, and because we're sort of domesticated this whole thing. Jesus, we see him as the one carrying a little lamb and sharing wisdom wherever he goes. Not the reaction at the time, though. People literally were completely blown away by what Jesus was talking about, and the question is, why? Why? As we read the first verse that Jesus sits down in the last, why are people astonished? What's going on? Now, in order for us to understand this, and even before I get to the poor in spirit, we need to just familiarize ourselves, Paul, with the times of Jesus. Because as you come to this church here, we're not a church that just says, Jesus sat down. When have you been sitting down? Have you been sitting down at the feet of Jesus and just say whatever? No, we can't just take the test and say whatever we want. In fact, we talked about it during the temptations. Remember, that's how Satan preaches. He just takes a psalm and then, uses it wherever. We can't do that here. We need to understand what these words actually mean, and that's what we do here together every week. So let's familiarize ourselves with the times of Jesus. Why were the multitudes astonished and amazed? Part of the answer is we don't know what the times look like. Which were the groups at the time that were disputing for the attention of Israel? In other words, Jesus is not just born out of, in Santa Fe and, there are Republicans and Democrats fighting for the attention of the population. Something different was happening back there. And it wasn't just Republicans and Democrats. No, it was basically four groups that were disputing for the attention of Israel, that were trying to make new disciples. Some of them didn't even care to make some disciples, but at least four groups. We can go into depth into all of them, but for now I just want you to familiarize with the four. Group number one, you have it right here. They're called the Sadducees. Have we heard about them? Yes or no? Yeah, we've heard about them. Very specific group. These were sort of the aristocrats of the time. Very refined, very, very theologically trained because they were tied to the priestly sect. They were part of what went on in the temple. So these guys didn't want a problem with Rome, Phil. They want to negotiate so that they can do their thing at the temple, so that Rome can continue doing their thing. So they were the more polished in society, that looked down on everybody that didn't have their social standing, or that wasn't born into their refined sort of family lineage. Okay? They had their doctrines, they had their understandings. They're particularly known for not believing in the resurrection of the dead and some other things. But for now, let's just remember that this is one of the groups at the time that had their own understanding of things, of who God was, of who we were as a people, of how the dynamic between God and people looked like. So far, so good? Sadducees. Very refined. Right? But there was a second group. This one is very famous to us, right? And they are the Pharisees. Have we heard about them? Yes or no? Yeah, we've made them into everything that's horrible with religion, right? If we don't like somebody, say, oh, you Pharisee. I mean, poor guys. These were good people, by the way. Very honest people, willing to know and try to understand who God was and what the law was all about. But apart from in distinction to the Sadducees, they not only tried to understand Torah, the written law, but they also had oral law. They also had additional rules and things that we'll soon know. By reading Matthew, we'll get more familiarized with those. But they were always fighting with each other. The Sadducees and the Pharisees were always in tension, amongst themselves. And they only joined together when they had something to say against Jesus, which was fascinating. Jesus even brought together the fiercest of enemies against him. That's what kind of figure Jesus was. But the Pharisees were sort of lay people. They were not necessarily formed in the rabbinical schools, but they knew Torah. They studied it thoroughly. I mean, these were heavy students of the Bible, and we've seen these guys. All these examples, we still have some of that in churches wherever we go. Adventist or no Adventist churches, we'll always find people who are, those who feel like they were born in the right family, right? And feel like, I'm a descendant of Ellen White or something. Oh, great. Well, there you go. And who am I? I'm just, I don't even know how to pronounce my own name here in the United States. It's horrible. So anyway, we still have some of that, maybe. And I don't know if another denomination, you're, a descendant of Billy Graham or so. Oh, my name is Tiago Graham or something like that. Or I don't know. We still have some of that. And that could bring some, I'm something here. And then the Pharisees, they had other priorities. They just liked those who were as thorough and as firm with what was written and with the law as they were. So other priorities, other dynamic, and also very interested in convincing Israel that they were right. These are the guys that normally stand at the door of the church saying, measuring the skirts of the ladies and seeing if they're wearing. So we still have some of that around. Not here though. We've been baptized in the fire in this church. And now we love you. Whatever you're wearing, whatever your dress, whatever your background, if you are a horrible person, you'll still find a place here. In fact, the newsletter this week, I wrote a little bit about what the early Christians looked like, and it's phenomenal. They were hated in society because they took into their fellowship everybody who was hated at the time. All these weird and horrible human beings found a way to go into the Christian community. So that's part of our aim, to be inclusive and to not be in a place where we're judging. But we still have people, even we need to always evaluate our own heart, not to be found in a place where we're distancing people and pushing them away. So, Sadducees at the time, Pharisees at the time, There were also Essenes at the time. Do we know these guys, who they are? Essenes? Think of, the best way to explain these guys, they're sort of like monks. Like, think of monasteries. They're isolated. They're away from society because they don't want to contaminate themselves. It was as if I was in Essene, for instance, I wouldn't even be here with you guys. No, I'm very preoccupied with my own holiness here. So I would probably speak from behind here because you're not worthy of seeing my face. I would probably do something like that. And no women were part of our group. There's some of that too. And we live outside as a confrontation to the way society is. We isolate ourselves. So sort of that movement, the Essenes. Some tie even John the Baptist to certain of these movements there, and because he was isolated in the middle of the desert. But anyway, Essenes also had their perception of God, of who we are, etc. So far, so good. Is this helping? So all these guys are out there. And number 4, the Zealots. Now, these guys were sort of the revolutionaries. These guys were very politically minded, and apart, like in distinction to the Sadducees, they hated Rome. They didn't care for Rome. They wanted to see Rome out of the place. They wanted to see Israel have freedom. They were assassins. They were people who had all these schemes to just do the political revolution, social, cause unrest so that Rome could be out and the reign of God could kick in. So you have all types of political perceptions, all types of theologies, and all of this was part of Jesus' culture. Poor man indeed. We only have Republicans and Democrats. I mean, we think we have a lot. I mean, you can imagine 4. It would be too much. But anyway, Jesus grew up in this context. We need to understand that when he stands up to speak, he's not only speaking a beautiful sermon that makes sense as we post it with a nice picture on Facebook or something for people to see. No, he's actually speaking truth. He's speaking words that will undo the very teachings that all these groups were sort of ventilating and promoting and pushing upon Israel. So no wonder by the end of the sermon, people are blown away. They're literally blown away because normally we don't get who Jesus was at the time. We don't understand that he was born into this. In fact, Jesus is about 30 years old when he opens his mouth to speak. What do you think he was doing for 30 years? We have no clue. He was probably working with his parents. But don't you think that he saw the Pharisees teaching? Don't you think that he heard the Essenes doing their thing? Don't you think that he knew what the Zealots were all about? He knew all these things. And when he goes up to speak now, he speaks about truth and about God in a way that the audience can't even process it because they're so used to the teaching of the other groups. They're so familiarized with it, and they come to the point that, number 3, when I mentioned revolution, is if Jesus' teaching is true, then that means everything else that we've learned so far has nothing to do with reality. If what Jesus is talking about is true, then that's the end of religion altogether. So no wonder now we understand why all these groups here had a problem with Jesus. Because if what Jesus is saying is right, then that's the end of our religion. So between me having to reevaluate my heart and let go of my thing, or having Jesus out of the picture, guess what they're going to choose? We got to kill this Jesus. Or else that's the end of religion as we know it. So now we understand at least a little bit of what was going on and why Jesus' words are so powerful, so meaningful, and so distant from us. Because we've domesticated the Sermon on the Mount. We've made it a little thing that, we say in passing that doesn't confront our religion and our heart and our way of doing things. So unless we are open to hear the words of Jesus and to understand what he's talking about and willing to be confronted by the contradiction who is Jesus, to evaluate how we have constructed our own religion through the words of Jesus, then we will never come to the conclusion that the people have, that this is truly astonishing and amazing. Why is it not amazing? Because we're used to it. Or we're too comfortable in our own religion that Jesus' words, we just found a way to plug it into whatever we believe in. So for our reading of the text, we need to be open. Open to be confronted by the words of Jesus as he explains the kingdom of heaven to us. Are we ready to go? Yes or no? All right, so let's go. Verse number 2. So what is Jesus going to talk about then? How is he going to explain the kingdom? So let's go. Good. Verse 2. And then Jesus opened his mouth and taught them, saying, verse 3, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The first thing, the first concern, the first truth Jesus wants to address, mind you, it's what it means to be happy. Isn't that interesting? Of all the things he could have said, of all the things he could have brought up, like a political thing, or of all the things, Mary, he could have thought of in those 30 years, what is the one thing that he begins addressing? Like a psalmist, he's saying, I want you to understand what true happiness is. Who are the ones who are truly blessed by God? Because at the time, blessing and happiness were sort of seen as the same thing. Blessing and happiness, these days, if I asked you what is happiness, what would you tell me? Think of it. Think of it for 1 second and tell me what we think blessing and happiness is. Because our society is sort of moved by the question, isn't it? We go shopping because we want to fulfill this desire to feel happy. We get into relationships or we get out of relationships so that we can feel happier. And then the reason why we give for going into or out of relationships is, I wasn't happy or I want to be happy. And so happiness is sort of a driving thing in our society. But if I asked you, you don't have to answer. Just answer to yourself, what is happiness? What does that look like? How would we paint that picture? Now, the deal here is the following. And correct me if I'm wrong. In our society here, let's have this little man I drew over here be us today. Does that resemble sort of what we look like? Probably not, but let's go with it, okay? Happiness in our society is sort of a personal experience, isn't it? A personal experience or feeling. That's sort of what it is, a feeling. If I have it, I'm good. If I don't have it, then I start to question myself. In fact, we even have religion revolve around our own feelings. If I'm feeling good, then God must be blessing me. If not, I'm not feeling good, then I must have done something wrong. That's how far we have taken the whole thing. Feelingness is an experience that I have inside. It's a feeling. It's good and I have it or I don't have it. Well, the unusual thing is that this is nowhere close to how the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Israel understood happiness or how Jesus will understand happiness. In fact, to Jesus, happiness has nothing to do with feeling or your circumstances. Because if it did, how we would put together blessed or happy are those who mourn. Wouldn't that be weird? We wouldn't be able to put that together if we understood happiness or blessing as a feeling. But to the people at the time of Jesus and to Jesus himself, happiness has nothing to do with something internal or something that's going on with me. Happiness, to these guys here and to Jesus, has to do with my relationship with God. Am I blessed by God? Am I part of the favor of God? Is God looking at me? So it has nothing to do with feeling. It has to do, though, with an assurance that I am favored, that I am blessed, and I am part of God's plan. So far, so good? Yes or no? Are we understanding this? What is happiness in the Bible? Is it a little feeling of... No, it has nothing to do with that. It's an internal conviction that I am seen by God. I'm going to repeat that. Happiness in the Bible, not a feeling. Maybe it doesn't mean that you can't have feelings. It's fine to have feelings. It's good. But can you imagine having something that is constantly happy in the sense of feeling and smiling? Would you be able to relate with me if I'm always like this? Hi, guys. Good to know that you're here. I'm always rejoicing because I'm a pastor and I need to be happy all the time. It'd be horrible. I'd be scared out of my mind. I would never come back here if I was smiling all the time. That would be so weird. Happiness in the Bible has nothing or little to do with feeling. But it has to do with what? Let's see if we picked it up. With how God perceives us. If I'm blessed, if I'm seen, if I'm favored by God. Now here comes the trick. Here comes the curious part. Is that this understanding of happiness and blessedness was the understanding at the times of Jesus. So what was the problem? The problem was that for the Sadducees, for the Pharisees, for the Essenes, and for the Zealots, they understood God and human beings. They understood the favor and blessing of God in different ways. You see? So here's the trick. For the Sadducees and Pharisees, the person who is favored by God, the one who is blessed and happy, who would those be, do you think? So for the Sadducees, for instance, who would they be? Those who have financial prosperity, right? Education, good education. Those are favored by God. I mean, do you remember also one episode with Jesus and the disciples where they come to a man who's there in need, and then they come and they say to Jesus, who has sinned? Because if the man is sick and invalid, then somebody must have done something to God so that God would have punished him. You guys remember that episode? Yeah. Yeah, blind guy, yeah. So in other words, the problem there is that in the minds of the disciples, they were still operating by the idea of blessedness and favor that they have heard of. In other words, if I don't have health, God is not blessing me. I'm not favored. I'm not seen. If I'm not financially thriving, God is not seeing me. It's not blessing me. And you can see the craziness of what Christian religion has become. Because in some places we have made financial prosperity the sign again that God is blessing us, when blessing has nothing to do with how well you're doing financially. That's why Jesus comes up and says, blessed are the poor. How countercultural is that? Whew. We can't fit into some of the stuff that goes on these days. So people had their own understanding of who was seen by God and favored by God and blessed by God. Pharisees might have thought that the blessed of God are those who are actually reading the Torah and doing what is right. So can you imagine growing up in that context? If I didn't have health, it was not just a matter of not having health, it's having to carry also the understanding that I'm not favored by God, that I'm not seen by God. And if I'm poor, same thing. And if I'm not able to keep the Torah, if I'm a sinner, if I have messed up, then I'm not blessed by God and I'm not seen by God. I'm not happy because I'm not blessed. So this was the context Jesus appears in. So he's not saying that now happiness is a feeling. No, he's now correcting this whole scheme of things. Because what Jesus is going to say is, forget everything you have heard. Let me tell you who truly God is looking for. Let me tell you truly who God is favoring and who God is blessing and who is seen as a real human being favored in the eyes of God. That's what Jesus will correct. So far, so good. Are we together? Yes or no? Good. So now let's go into Jesus' hermeneutic, how he interprets the whole thing, and we're going to see it's actually the opposite of what everything was structured and settled at the times of Jesus. Jesus comes in and says, you want to know who truly are the blessed? You want to know who truly are the ones who are favored by God, the ones who can call themselves happy? Well, number one, the whole list of the Beatitudes now will be a list of people who are blessed. So Jesus will make a whole list of those who are favored, those who are blessed, those who are happy, regardless of their circumstances. And the first example, the first group that Jesus points to as those guys, they're blessed, they're happy. God's favor is upon them, God's eyes are upon them, and Jesus says, these are the poor in spirit. Now, question obviously is, what does that mean? What does poor in spirit mean? Now, at the time, we need to remember that Jesus' Sermon on the Mount is not necessarily something completely unique and new. Jesus will pick up on texts and messages in prophetic writings of the past and bring them back to the front because Israel had forgotten who truly God was, what God was truly about. So when Jesus says poor in spirit, what does it mean? Well, there are at least two texts that come into mind. You don't have to open them. I'll read them to you. Number one is Isaiah 57. Look at what Isaiah will say. Isaiah 57:15 says, for this is what the high and exalted one says, he who lives forever, whose name is holy. I live in a high and holy place, but also with the one who is contrite and poor in spirit, to revive the spirit of the lowly, and to revive the heart of the contrite. So we've seen this language before. Isaiah 66 verse 2 says, "But this is the one to whom I will look," God says, "he who is humble and contrite and poor in spirit and trembles at my word." So what can we say about poverty? Jesus says, blessed, happy. You want to see who has the favor of God, Yvette? You want to see who's blessed by God? You want to know who can call themselves happy and blessed? Let me tell you, they're poor. Now, what does poverty mean? In the most basic sense, poverty means that I cannot live, I cannot survive with my own resources. That I'm always in need of help, I'm always in need of aid, I'm always in need of something that will help me survive and move forward. Now, poverty can have different contexts and explanations in different circumstances and countries, but the basic meaning is just that. I cannot survive on my own. I need something else. So let's just define poverty for 1 second. Three things that we need to recognize. That number one, poverty is recognizing the recognition of need. I'm in need. I cannot do it on my own. That's number one. That's poverty. That's the moment we recognize we're poor. Not even thinking about spiritual things, just material things. Now, Jesus, though, He comes in and He doesn't just say, blessed are the poor, although Jesus will spend a lot of time with those who are not financially wealthy. He loves to spend time with those who have nothing. But Jesus says, happy, blessed, the eyes of God, the favor of God are toward those who are poor in spirit, in spiritual things. So we need to interpret this poverty within that spiritual context that was so prevalent during the times of Jesus. That were portraying, these groups were portraying the image of what spirituality or religion was. And here comes Jesus and says, no, you haven't understood. Happy and blessed are not the ones who have it all together. Blessed are not the ones who have done every single thing right. Blessed are those who recognize themselves as poor in the things of the Spirit. This is just amazing. It's the recognition that I am spiritually bankrupt. It is the recognition that my standing with God has less to do with the pride I feel when I do something right and much more to do with the actions and faithfulness of God Himself. To be poor in spirit is to always recognize our spiritual need. Are you understanding how powerful this is? Can you imagine these words coming out in a religion, in a context where people were only blessed when they felt that they were doing every complete single little thing right? And then Jesus comes up and says, no, let me tell you, if you do not have things figured out, if you have not done well, if you have failed, and you recognize that poverty, well, guess what? God's eyes are with you. His favor is with you. And heaven belongs to you. Of course Jesus was going to be killed, man. I mean, come on. It's crazy. Completely crazy. The whole religious structure of the time was based on how well you perform for God. And then Jesus says, have you underperformed? Do you recognize that you're not able to make it? Well, good. Now, to bring it into context with us, do you know at the beginning of the year when you say, oh, this year I'm going to read my whole Bible, and then you get to Numbers and you fail and you feel horrible? Or that you say, well, I'm going to forgive that person, but then a week goes by, 2, and then you just go back to your ways and you feel horrible. Or when we feel like we're horrible parents, that we haven't prayed enough or done enough. Or that we're just not being, what has been portrayed of a good Christian to people. Always jumping and smiling and doing things and forgiving quickly. And we feel remorse and we feel horrible because we are not able to do every single thing we've heard we're supposed to do. Well, at the moment we recognize that reality, guess what? That's the moment we're recognizing our poverty in spiritual things. And we need to interpret all these feelings of incapability, Paul, as the sign that God's eyes have not left us, but are with us, that His favor is close to us, and that we are blessed, and that there is a future for all those who recognize their poverty. Oof. There's a parable. Open your Bible with me to Luke. Let's jump to Luke real quick. That will illustrate this very thing. Because Jesus will now become very vocal as the Gospels move forward. In regards, Ina, to those who have performed, who think they have a nice standing before God, and then start to criticize and to isolate those who underperform. So if Jesus is saying that blessed are those who recognize their inability to do what is right, who are broken, happy are those, to them belongs the kingdom of heaven, then just realize that at the time of Jesus, they were the opposite of that. People who isolated people for underperforming. And this is a parable exactly about that, and this is found in Luke chapter 18, verse 9. And look at how it begins. He, Jesus, also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous. Righteousness meaning that they have done all things right. And what happened, sis? And they treated others with contempt. Can somebody explain that word, contempt? What does that mean? Disdain. You know, I've been a member of the church for I don't know how many years. I've always studied the lesson. I have done all these. Don't get me wrong, all these things are great. But the problem is that they have made the blessing into something to feel extra proud about themselves for. And now, through their righteousness and goodness, they start understanding that there are some people around Andreas who are not like them, not as good as them, no. They are not plant-based, Phil. They're not doing all these good things. You know, and you feel sorry for them, obviously, right? Oh, poor guys. They haven't followed God as well as we have. They haven't figured things out as well as we. But we'll pray for them. It's not that you're judging them. No, let's pray for them. Right? And we feel that contempt, that holy vanity of thinking we have done things right. So we always need to beware. That temptation is always there, isn't it? Even if you are recognizing yourself as poor, you can still fall into that temptation, thinking, oh, I'm poor, but he thinks he's still great. And I can fall into the same trap. Whenever you turn something into pride or vanity and isolate and judge others by it, you're found in the problem of what Jesus is talking about, of treating others with contempt. So let's look at the parable. You know this parable. You know this story. Let me share it with you. Jesus tells it to those who feel themselves righteous and treat others with contempt. Jesus says, 2 men, how many? 2 went up into the temple to pray. One a Pharisee. Look at that. One of these guys here. And the other a tax collector. This is one I didn't bring up. Let's talk about them for a second. Do you know who tax collectors are? Are they from Israel or from outside of Israel? They're primarily Israelites who work with what kingdom? Israel or Rome? Rome. So these are Israel, Jews who are working with Rome to do what? To collect tax. And we know from the Gospels that these guys understood that there was a mechanism there to make some cash on the side, right? In other words, they were hated by other Israelites and Jewish people. Why? Because these guys were loyal only to one entity, really, and that's the Roman Empire, and to cash. In cash we trust. We have it on our dollar bill too. In God we trust. So the idea is that these guys are truly hated. In fact, Matthew here, who's writing this book, what was he, Pastor Eric? He was a tax collector himself. How wonderful. Everybody, and Jesus is calling all these guys to follow. So can you imagine how problematic Jesus was? So whenever you choose a pastor next time, keep that in mind. Don't bring just a little, right, Pastor Eric? Don't try to bring it. Just remember that Jesus brought together all these weird people into place to follow him and to become the new Israel. But these guys here were hated. So Pharisees, not very well liked, some very liked. And when Jesus mentions the Pharisee, they say, oh, that's a righteous person. He's probably going to do the right thing. And then Jesus brings in a tax collector and say, oh, we know how that's going to go about. It's not going to be good. Tax collectors are horrible people. So let's see what happens. 2 guys, Pharisee, tax collector, verse 11. The Pharisee, standing by himself, Because obviously the religion of the Pharisees is, it's all about me and how well I'm doing. He prayed thus to God, I thank you that in other words, thank you, God, for me. Could you imagine now in just Santa Fe without me and you? Thank God for Pastor Tiago. Oh boy, what would have been the church, Pastor Eric, without you and I? Thank God for me. Yeah, we got to beware. We got to be careful with that stuff. But that's the prayer. Thank you, God, for me. And look at what he says. I am not like other men. Nope. Extortioners, unjust, adulterers, those who don't study the Sabbath school, those who don't come to church. That's the basis of their religion. I am not like the others because I have done things, I have performed in a particular way. Therefore, thank God for me. I'm not like other men, and I'm not even like this tax collector right there. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. I keep the Sabbath, and I wait for the return of Jesus. I have performed, and I'm great. Thank God for me. And then Luke just interrupts this boastful prayer and just turns the camera to the tax collector. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but he would beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Before we jump into conclusions, keep in mind, tax collectors, they went out to knock at people's door, saying, time for the tax, put it into the bin, and guess what people would ask of them? Be merciful. I don't have it. Have mercy. And guess what tax collectors did not give people? Mercy. So here, don't think that this story is about, a good guy or a bad Pharisee and then a good little tax collector that is... No. Both are horrible human beings. And that's how we need to approach this story, that there's no good and bad. There's no me and you. We're all in this story somehow. Either comparing us for good things, I'm better than whatever, or comparing others through the negative route, which is, Jim is so good. I wish I could be more like Jim. Confession time. I truly wish I was more like you. But you guys see what I'm saying? I can compare myself to others, either in good or in bad, that measure. So both guys, not good. One praising himself and everything else, and the other asking of God that which he doesn't give to people, probably. But at least there's a difference between each, isn't there? So let's at least think a little bit about that difference, Paul. Let's use this here. While the Pharisee here has a religion that is based on what? Whose works? His own. His self-performance. That's it. That's what coordinates his religion. And then when he doesn't perform, guess what happens to his religion? What do you think happens to those who live a religion of I have to do this, I can't do that, and then you don't do what you think you're going to do? Guess what happens to your relationship to God? It falls to the ground. Why? Because the whole structure of your religion is based on you and your little actions. That's why we have a lot of anxiety in our midst sometimes, because we feel like we've messed up, we've done something stupid, and we can't even show up in church. We're like this tax collector that we're standing far off because we feel like we're so distant because of our performance. The tax collector was living that kind of religion too. He knew he underperformed. He knew he didn't do things right. So two guys. One trusts in one single thing, and it's in his performance of the law. Thank God for me. Consequently, his interaction with others will be how? Do I see others as equal or as different? Different. This religion is about self and it is about difference. I look at others and I say, not remnant. Oh, sorry, you have not understood the 2,300-day prophecy. Too bad. Are you guys with me? Yes or no? It's a religion based on my performance, on my obedience, which again, not bad. Not bad to be obedient. Not bad to seek for righteousness and doing what is right. The problem is turning that into a resource for pride and vanity and confidence in self that leads to distance from all those who are sinners. Because sinners now become what? A threat to my holiness. You see? I don't mingle with those who are unmingable, because they're going to be a threat to my religion. And here's Jesus walking around with prostitutes. So put that together so you can see how Jesus felt about the whole deal. So far, so good? So one spiritual thing, my relationship with God is based on my works, and my relationship with others is based on difference. So now let's go to the other guy. The other guy has understood that he has performed or underperformed. Underperformed. And instead of trying to feel confident or boast in what he does, all he says is, forgive me, because I'm a sinner. He recognizes what, Mary? I heard. He recognizes his poverty in spiritual things. So whether you are a person who does perform and is obedient, which is great, in the moment we forget our poverty and our need for God, that's the very moment where we distance ourselves from what Jesus is teaching. We should always be found in that space and in that place where we recognize and we're mindful of our poverty. That's why this is the first thing that Jesus brings up. In fact, in the weeks to come, we're going to see every single beatitude, every single understanding of who is blessed and favored by God, and we're going to see is that sequence. Next week, we're going to learn about those who mourn. In other words, when I recognize my poverty, there's something that happens, and that's next week. So come next week to learn about that. For now, the difference. The second guy, he is open to a religion of who is in control of the works. He is or God is? God is. Lord, forgive me. He's open to the action of God. Open to the trust that God will perform and do what He is unable to do for Himself. Are you guys with me so far? So while one religion closes itself to my works and my performance, the other is always open. I can't do everything. I recognize my poverty. That's the vertical part. Now, how does that relate to others now? Because notice, if I recognize my poverty, if I recognize my need, when I look around and I look at you, Dave, when I look around and I see Dolores, I see Kim, I see Yvette, I see all you guys, what do you think I see? If I'm open to God and recognizing constantly my need and poverty, how do you think I'm going to see others? As different or as people just like me in need of grace and mercy? Tell me, different or the same? And here lies the powerful truth of blessed are the poor in spirit. We are not called to be different from the world in the sense that we are so great and they are not. There's only one equality that God seeks, and that comes from recognizing not our difference. The only difference God requires is not the one that says, I'm different from you. It's, I am equal. We're the same. We're all poor. And in the moment I see Sis and Angela and Cliff and every one single one of you as equals, then I become different from the world. Because the world loves differences. It loves to say these are poor and these are rich. These are this political group, the other political group. The world loves difference, loves to put us in compartments. But this is the radical teaching of Jesus. Once you recognize your poverty before me, you'll look at others with mercy. You'll look at others with equality. And no wonder Jesus walked around with everybody. Why? Because He understood that all human beings are poor and in need of grace. That's why Jesus comes and says, I haven't come for those who feel that they are healthy and doing great. I have come for those who are sick and recognize their poverty. So that's how the text ends. That's how the parable ends. God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Happy. You want to know who's happy? You want to know who's blessed? You want to know who's favored by God? You want to know who God has his eye on? It's not those who think they're so great because they're performing, but it's those who recognize their poverty in spiritual things. For them belongs the kingdom of heaven. What a powerful thing. To be found in that religion when I'm not trusting in myself, but I trust in the work of God. So that when I look at every single face that is here and that is out in the city, I do not feel any pride of difference. I see them as equals, in need of grace and mercy. And I become different from the world by becoming equal to everyone around me. Oh, man. I'm excited about the Sermon on the Mount. Are you? I feel there are some lessons here for us, and Jesus is giving us the blueprint of what religion truly looks like. Not a religion where I'm different from the other. Now, keep in mind, don't think that these teachings are disattached from Daniel and Revelation. Okay? When we go out into the world, you will have a choice of interpreting those who understood 2,300 days and saying, oh, they're different, or following Jesus into understanding that, no, we're all in need of grace. And all the prophetic work that we have in the Bible ties into the kingdom that Jesus has established. A kingdom where every single person has a place at the table. And there is food for all.